Hi, this is T with TeaQuilts, and I'm here today to do a video on crazy quilts. That was a viewer request by Patricia. I'll leave your YouTube name at the bottom of the screen. It's for crazy quilts that she can actually use on the bed, and also she wants to know some foundations to use as well. So what I have here just to do a demo is 6 squares that I've cut. I did starch my fabrics beforehand, and I am going to do a quick technique where I'm going to stack all 6 layers and then cut through them, sort of like a stack and slash method to make a crazy quilt block. So the first thing I want to do is I want to cut my corners off, 2 diagonal ends, and they can be any size. So I started with squares about 10 3/4 big, so that's what I'm using. And so I want to make take another corner off. So now I have 1 cut and 2 cuts. Now I'm going to sort of go straight up. Let me slide this up. I want to cut from this corner to that corner. So that is my 3rd cut. And then perhaps cut from here to here. So that's my 4th cut, and then my final cut is going to be through the center. And you can angle these cuts any way you want. Okay. So the key to making these cuts is that how you made these cuts or how you're going to sew them back together. So these 2 will be sewn together first, then I'll add this corner, and then this corner, and then these 2 can go on the outside edges. So the first thing I want to do before I start sewing anything back together is I want to take fabrics and flip them so that I have a different fabric in each of these sections. So I'm going to leave this as the first fabric, flip under the top fabric to the bottom, and then I'm going to take the top 2 fabrics and move it to the bottom. Now I want the top 3 fabrics to the bottom, top 4, and then the last one will be the bottom fabric on top. So that's a good way of getting them to look scrappy. And then I just go back to my sewing machine. I line up one edge and sew. So I'll go do that to this set of fabrics, and then I'll come back. Okay, I'm back with my chain, and it is important that you keep these pieces in exact order. So when you're piecing them back together, you will not end up with 2 pieces of fabric being the same in each block. So I'm just going to cut my chain apart and place my fabric in position. So here are my pieces, and next I want to sew these pieces onto the stack, but I want to do them in order. Sometimes you will have too much overhang where you'll need to trim a straight edge. So if you need to do that, go ahead and do that. I'm just going to go ahead and do mine off camera, and then I will come back with this piece sewn to here. I'm back and I have sewed my third piece onto the unit, and when I sewed, I actually left a little dog ear out on one side so that when I sewed that seam it would make a straight edge here, but then on the other side you will have a jaggy edge. And for right now I'm not going to worry about that. What I want to make sure is through my stack that all of my bottom ends are straight, so I'm going to square all of these edges up, and then when I put this piece on, I want to make sure that this one's a weird angle, so I'm actually gonna put it right there and stitch my seam down the side. So I just wanted to show you how you actually line these up. I'm going to square the bottoms of my block up, and then I'm going to add my remaining pieces. I'm going to add these to the bottom. I'm going to square up everything and then add this to the side, and then add this to the other side. So I'll be back when I have the block completed. I'm back and I have all of my blocks sewn together, and I made sure to keep them in order so that all 6 of my blocks would have one piece of the fabric in it and not have any duplicates. And while we're talking about the number of fabrics, do note that I'm only doing this as a video presentation, and if I was doing this in real life I could have added like 10 layers of fabric together and still done these same 6 cuts, and then each block would have had 6 of the 10 fabrics, and then I would repeat that process for however large I want to make my quilt top. So the next step in this with these blocks, and I'm only going to do one on camera because I'm not actually making a crazy quilt, I'm just doing this for demo purposes, is I want to square this block up to a particular size. So I want to try to get the largest size that I can get, and because I'm diagonally instead of in front of my cutting system, it's going to be a little awkward and I may be out of camera. But basically I just want to take a square up ruler, lay it on my block, and see what is the largest possible size that I can cut. And right now it looks like maybe a 9-inch square would be the largest that I can cut. So that's what I'm going to do. Remember, I started with blocks with squares that were 10 3/4. So now they're going to go down to 9 inches. So I'm just going to make sure for my first cuts that I have 9 inches inside everywhere. And remember that we put starch into these blocks, so we don't have to worry about the straight of grain. It got a little stabilizing in it, but you don't want to be rough with the blocks either. So then I'm just going to take this and square this up to 9 inches. Now with these cuts, it took off a little over 2 inches. I say 2 inches and a quarter from where I started, because by the time I do seam allowances, my blocks are going to end up 8.5 inches wide. So keep that in mind. Also, when you're cutting, you don't have to do these cuts. You can do any number of cuts in any direction you want. You just make sure you keep track of the order to sew them back together. So now that I have that, the second part of the question was, what type of foundation would I use on a crazy quilt? And I would use a piece of muslin on the back of a crazy quilt because I want the foundation to stay. And I feel like the muslin is a good base for that. So I will just cut a piece of muslin that's a little bit bigger than my block. I'm not going to worry about cutting it to size right now. because it may draw up a little bit doing the stitching. So I got that down, and the next thing that I want to do is use some temporary basting spray to adhere this block to the muslin. You can use any temporary basting spray that you like. This is the first one that I got my hands on. It's the 505 Spray and Fix, but any temporary adhesive will do. And I will spray this away from the camera, and then I will come back. So I have my fabric sprayed, and I did not worry about going to the edges. All I want to do is just temporarily hold this down so that when I go to my sewing machine, I'm not dealing with two pieces of fabric. I just want to deal with the one. So there's my piece. It will not fall off just because I have put some in the middle. I didn't want to spray a whole lot in my current area, so I just sprayed a little bit to hold the center down. What I'm going to do is go to my machine. I'm going to baste stitch in this area. I'm back at my sewing machine, and I'm changing my stitch length to a basting stitch. So I'm going to stitch at about 5.0 millimeters just to hold this down temporarily. And I'm not using a really tight stitch because I want the fabric to have the option to move if it needs to, and or I can clip them easily if I have to. I just don't want it flopping everywhere. And you don't have to necessarily even do this step if you don't want, but I just like doing this, especially if I'm doing a hand embellished quilt, because I'm going to be working on it a while and I don't want the pieces flopping around. But with this method, we're doing it based on how we would do it from a sewing machine. So now I have it basted. One other thing that you can do is when you're making crazy quilt blocks, normally you have a reasoning behind making the crazy quilt block. Some people like to make it a memory quilt, and so they'll make things that pertain to them or some family member or someone special or some event. So you can do a block for a person or per event or something like that. So I think I'm going to use my embroidery machine, and I'm going to just put tea in here just to give it some color. And then I'm going to use some trims on this as well. Now the thing with trims, if you're trying to make a crazy quilt for a bed, is that you don't want to use a lot of hard or bulky items. You want to use more your flat trims like ribbons, which I have pulled a couple here. So you might want to use ribbons. You could use quick bias tape, and they have like a lot of the different colors. This is a rainbow one. And you could use some braid where you're stitching over the braid. I wouldn't recommend very bulky items like big decorative buttons, because remember, you're going to be sleeping in the bed with those items. So I just have some things in here. I like to use yarns. You have a lot of decorative trim and yarns that can still be used on the bed quilt. You just need to make sure that you secure very well. You can use regular yarn as well, and you can braid it and then use your machine to stitch it all down. So with this project, we're actually going to be using our sewing machine because we want to be able to use this on a bed. So one thing you need to do if you're using yarn is that you do need to leave a tail so that you can take the yarn. Say if I'm stitching this yarn here, I want to be able to leave a tail so that I can thread a needle and take this yarn to the back, because I don't want these tails hanging in my quilt, and I don't want to have the ends showing on the ends. If I could just like zigzag stitch or ladder stitch this ribbon down, but I don't want to have these raw edges still in my quilt, so I want to leave some tails. Again, I'm assuming that if you're making this for a bed quilt, that it's going to be washed a lot, so I don't want any raw edges on the front. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this into my machine. I'm going to embroider my name on here, and then I will be right back. Okay, I'm back here, and I have my tea on my block, and I had some issues with my sewing machine. My screws fell out of the quilt frame, so it went cattywampus, but anyway, that's a whole nother issue. What I wanted to show was that on most sewing machines you have a lot of decorative stitching, and I don't know if you can really see my screen very well because of the light, but I've got a button here that says character or decorative stitch, and there's a lot more patterns in here, so I can actually click these patterns here and I get a whole slew of patterns. So I have changed also to decorative thread up at the top, and I've changed my foot on the machine to an open toe foot that will stitch out the embroidery. So back over here to the screen, I'm just going to pick a stitch, and let's just pick this stitch here, and then you can control if it's what size it is, as far as it large, is it continuous. So I have my continuous button right here already clicked. If I just wanted one of those, I would click the button and it would make a single one of those units. So but I do want it continuous, so I'm going to put that back. The other thing I recommend is stitching it on a piece of scrap. So I'm just going to use temporarily this piece of muslin. And so this is how that stitch will look. So the other thing to remember when you're using these is that, remember, we want to pull our threads into the back. So in order to do that, you need to leave thread tails on the front end as well as the back end. So I will start here. I'm going to put on my back stitch feature, and then I'm going to put the center of my presser foot. It's going to be riding along this first line here. And now I'm down at the bottom. I want to hit the back stitch button so it can give me a few tacking stitches, but I don't want to cut. So I'm going to lift up my needle and pull this out and then trim my threads. So this is what that seam looks like. I'm actually using a variegated thread, so it goes from light pink to white to a little bit of light pink, and then it starts to gradually get darker in pink. So I left my thread tails, even though I backstitch, I left my thread tails so that I can pull them to the back, just because I don't want any little threads on top of the quilt top. And now let's try to use a ladder stitch. I don't have much bobbin thread left, so we'll see what it can do for us. So we're going to do a ladder stitch. We're going to keep it large. And we're actually going to put this ribbon down, just to show you that you can put some trim on. Now when I stitch this ribbon down, I'm going to put it over the center of the seam, but I need to line up my foot with the edge of the ribbon. So I don't know how wide this is. I haven't tested it. I'm just doing this for a demo. And I'm trying to pull my... Now since this is on the edge of the quilt where the ribbon could be caught in the actual seaming when I seam the blocks together, I don't have to necessarily leave a tail for this. So I'm just going to start stitching. It's going to do some tacking stitches first, and then it's going to kick out and catch my ribbon. So I'll show you this one when I'm done. So here is my ribbon that was put on by machine. And I left the tails hanging, and I did not have to because these will be caught in the seams, but I just want to get in the habit of not cutting my threads automatically by my machine or cutting them really close. So that was one of the ways that I did that. So I would continue to go around this. Like I said, since I'm not making a crazy quilt, I'm not going to continue, but I just wanted to give you some ideas on what you could do with making a crazy quilt by machine. And the more you add into it, the prettier the blocks will actually be. I hope this video was helpful to you, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye bye for now.